If you were to collect all the writing on Dark Souls since its release and stack it upon itself, I think it might reach the moon. Dark Souls is such a thoroughly discussed game that writing an essay on it is essentially a joke, a rite of passage for all those who endeavor to write about video games. The discussion of Dark Souls extends out into other areas of the internet and culture at large with tenuous connection or context. Phrases like Evangelion is the Dark Souls of anime makes us collectively roll our eyes. I don't think another game has been so thoroughly picked to the bone. And yet, despite discussion being so pervasive, I have noticed the gulf between people who have played Dark Souls and those who haven't is gigantic. And I'm not speaking of skill, but of understanding. And while that might seem obvious, it appears that Dark Souls is often mischaracterized. To those on the outside, they seem to see an arbitrarily difficult, sadistic video game filled with BS that's unfair, intentionally obtuse, has forced grinding, and mechanics that waste your time, played by a self-aggrandizing community of bloodthirsty, hardcore capital G gamers that intentionally sabotage other players, all while condescending to newcomers and gatekeeping the less skilled and less invested by withholding advice, using peer pressure, and engaging in purity testing. At this point, it seems almost impossible to have no preconceptions about the game before playing it, and it seems impossible to not have strong feelings, whether good or bad. There seems to be a lack of common ground in this area. This is a trend that I've noticed from personal interactions over time. The perception of Dark Souls on the outside is often wildly different from the perception on the inside. By that I mean, if you've actually given Dark Souls a fair shot, you know that none of these perceptions truly characterize the game, or its community. If you haven't though, it seems probable that your perception is get good, prepare to die, and corpse running ad nauseum, even though that isn't the whole picture. And while not knowing something isn't an issue, and not liking something isn't a problem either, my grievance, in this specific case, is often people are wrong about what they actually dislike about the game, and my source of frustration comes from them refusing to acknowledge when I or others try to persuade them otherwise. Very rarely have I seen someone just say, "You know, Dark Souls wasn't for me," and leave it at that. I find people often learn the wrong lesson from the game, crystallize their opinions, and then jump ship. It's very difficult to have a conversation about the game once this has happened. There's a mystique around Dark Souls that has given the game a near mythical status, and it seems nothing short of going through the process of learning how to engage with the game on its own terms will actually demystify it. Unfortunately, often, the opposite happens. Most of the people I know in this category give up within the first 3 areas. And this probably speaks to an inadequacy on my part, but once this happens, I don't think I've ever been able to reassure someone that Dark Souls isn't actually as malicious as they think it is, no matter how hard I've tried. It's always been something they had to do for themselves, and it's only happened a handful of times. I have often seen this perceptual gap negatively impact people's enjoyment, usually making them give up and develop something of a grudge. This can reinforce itself even deeper when people on the inside attempt to convince them their understanding of the game is faulty, especially if they use the argument that I'm using right now, which is that these players gave up before they had a chance to really judge the game for what it actually is, rather than via the lens of their preconceived notions. This is a broader issue in general that has recently become particularly apparent to me regarding Dark Souls, which is that people are generally unwilling to accept that they might hold misconceptions about something. A major discovery, I know. And yet there is something about Dark Souls that makes people dig their heels in with a high level of consistency. This creates scenarios where people aren't just disinterested, but where they flat out refuse to play the game almost as a matter of principle, and where people on the inside refuse to see the game from an outside perspective and then dictate the true Dark Souls experience from an ivory tower. It's hard to argue Dark Souls is not as hard as you think it is without being, or appearing, condescending. The subtext is, you're just bad at the game, lol, which is echoed into a deafening rally cry of get good, or as we say these days, skill issue. It's easy to develop a complex in regards to Dark Souls, in both directions. There are those who use get good as a firm but hopefully encouraging chastisement. Others use it as a condescending cudgel. Sometimes both. I still try to this day to get people to see the game the way I do, and I don't think I've ever truly succeeded, because ultimately it's not something that you can really convince people of. They have to engage with the game on its terms to really understand it. But in my experience, people I've known bounce off the game and then cement their opinions. A lot of this has to do with what I'm doing right now. I am adding to the infinite heap of Dark Souls Discourse. A friend of mine told me not to write this solely because it contributes to this phenomenon, and he can't stand the Souls fanbase. And yet, I find it very interesting. How can such a thoroughly analyzed game be so mischaracterized? Probably because people like me have mercilessly mocked people who just don't care to engage with the game, and our own words echo in their head like an abusive parent. Get good, casual, maybe you should just go play Call of Duty instead. I've done this with extreme prejudice in the past, while simultaneously trying to convince others that no, it's really not that hard. It's easy to develop a complex about Dark Souls, in both directions. I simultaneously want people to engage with Dark Souls the way I think that they should, but have mocked people in the past for not doing so. I have offered advice to help make the game easier for others, and resented other players for doing the exact same things I've said to do. Is it any wonder there seems to be no common ground for Dark Souls? It seems I'm a self-aggrandizing hardcore capital G gamer with a thirst for blood. The only other thing I can think of that has garnered such an obsessive fan base that talks at excessive length, overanalyzes its contents, dissects its deeper meanings to the point of absurdity, and argues over useless minutia is Evangelion. Oh, you like Evangelion? Who's best girl? Dark Souls is the Evangelion of video games. Evangelion's fanbase has created a mystique around the series by lavishing praise on it at every turn, despite the source material relying almost exclusively on things that came before it. By dragging the discussion into unrelated topics, by arguing the meaning of its symbolism, overall message, and impact on the wider industry, and yet often missing the entire point of the show altogether. Going so far as to make Hideki Anno attempt to kill himself, lose all love for his creation, and want to leave the industry entirely. By taking elements and making them into core identity traits. By overemphasizing the weight of major elements of the experience, and taking personal offense when challenged. Evangelion is about acknowledging that hating yourself leads to hating others, and rejecting others causes the very pain you seek to flee from. Evangelion is about learning to love yourself, and how loving others is worth the pain that they will inevitably cause you. Dark Souls is about not being overly attached to transient things, and allowing the natural flow of life to take its course. Everything ends. Both of these messages work in tandem with one another, and both communities have often missed the forest for the trees, and so have I. And perhaps this is the core of the issue. My desire to be correct overpowering my desire to act correctly. Is Dark Souls mischaracterized? The answer to that question depends on who answers. I think you already know where I stand, but often my desire to be correct wins out. I saw Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence in theaters recently, and I found that movie to be entirely lacking in meaning or substance. I had no strong feelings outside of disappointment towards it until I saw an unreasonably large number of 5-star reviews praising its philosophical depth, of which there is none. That movie was, to me, the literal definition of pretentious. But seeing the praise lavished on this movie, and some saying it was better than the original, drove me up the wall. How can they be so wrong? Maybe the reason people are so reflexive about Dark Souls is because they feel cornered. Because you can't simply dislike Dark Souls without an excuse. And even if their reason is valid, they're discredited. And even if they do get good, they don't get good the right way. Perhaps people get defensive over having not played Dark Souls, not liking Dark Souls, or just straight up not caring about Dark Souls because of the unending praise we heap upon it, deservedly or not. Maybe they get frustrated when they don't like it because they feel as if they've somehow excluded themselves from the party. And maybe because people like me get really frustrated when other people have incorrect opinions about Dark Souls. But honestly, doesn't that mean that I'm just as wrong about Dark Souls too?